rent?
Hello YouTube, this is DVD Review Studios here, and today I'm going to be doing a collection overview looking through the current 8 theatrical Spider-Man movies. With Spider-Man No Way Home releasing in the coming months, I thought we'd look back on the legacy of the Spider-Man character across the 8 current films that we have. I won't be including any sort of spin-off movies such as Venom, or any kind of randomized MCU kind of cameo appearances, just the prominent Spider-Man movies about the iconic comic book character. And so throughout this video, I'll be ranking each individual movie, placing them in a top 8 list. I've done similar videos in the past, such as with the Pixar movies, the Stanley Kubrick films that I'd seen, and more recently the Planet of the Apes franchise. And so going through these films, let's begin in chronological order of release, starting with the original Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie. From an era where comic book movies were more experimental and not the result of corporate cash cow greed, we have the first Spider-Man movie from 2002. And this film was directed by horror director Sam Raimi, I guess primarily well known for the Evil Dead movies, and he was a very intriguing choice for establishing a superhero franchise, and it's evidently paid off in the long term. Comic book movies, I guess, seemed more risky and more experimental compared to how these movies are celebrated in the modern era, and this heavy sort of retrospective change, choosing a director with a keen eye for detail who was clearly dedicated to the project at hand, has paved the way forward, and this film has become now one of my favourite character origin stories. This story has the hint of wonder and adventure, where we see Peter Parker discover the unexpected, and with my own personal bias, growing up with the Raimi Spider-Man movies, Tobey Maguire is easily my favourite incarnation of the character. I feel he encapsulated what it felt to be, I guess, an out-of-touch kind of nerdy high schooler, which is juxtaposed by the famed, cheesy superhero of Spider-Man. And with the struggles he goes through, whether as Peter or as Spidey, he has quite the hero's journey across the trilogy. Spider-Man's origin is made to be fun, where Peter experiences noticeable changes following the spider bite scene, such as where his vision miraculously improves, he wakes up one morning just fully ripped, his grip improves, which is one of my favourite shots where we see the hairs on his fingertips grow outward, only for him to then basically do the impossible, jumping and swinging building to building. And I love the sequence where he learns to use the web shooting kind of feature. It's a very bizarre moment. I personally prefer the sort of mechanical web shooter as seen in the Andrew Garfield and Tom Holland movies. But all of these sequences kind of build on Peter's character, which makes a lot of what this film is seem so full of wonder. And that's especially when Peter is discovering his capabilities, such as where he's in complete awe of being able to knock out the school bully Flash, utilizing his newfound skills. And this scene was very satisfying with how bewildered the other students are, including MJ. Kirsten Dunst portrays a fantastic love interest as Mary Jane, coming off films such as The Virgin Suicides, where she was a standout actress in this film for me personally, and she offers a lot. I love how across the 3 films, she was heavily fleshed out as kind of a stage actress. Her role in this film in particular is that of like a damsel in distress, which is a common theme, I guess, but she evolves away from simply being the woman that Spider-Man saves. And that eventually leads into a very interesting kind of love triangle between MJ, Peter, and Harry Osborn, played by James Franco. And this has to be one of his standout performances of really his entire career. He handles a dramatic role a lot better than anything comedic, while still maintaining the fun sort of chemistry with those around him, such as obviously Harry being Peter's best friend throughout the film. For the villain, we have the Green Goblin, made ever iconic by Willem Dafoe's incredible performance. I was actually looking at a video made for Variety Fair about his acting career, and I was surprised to hear about how much he really wanted this role. It clearly meant a lot to him, and he gave it his all. And playing Norman Osborn slash the Green Goblin, he takes a serum to enhance his reflexes, seeking revenge on those who wronged him, those who literally backed him out of his own company of Oscorp. And even behind the mask, the nihilism he possesses, even trying to turn Peter Parker away from being a hero, generates the selfish nature of a man with literally nothing left to lose other than himself. And with so many horror-inspired visuals, the film does a phenomenal job establishing a comic book movie, leading really a standalone franchise with the detailed visuals, brutal fight sequences that definitely challenge the more contemporary Marvel films we view today. I'd like to think this film heavily inspired a lot of the content going forward, where it showed there was a clear market demographic for comic book-based movies. And this film really has stuck with me over the years. I would rank this at the number 2 spot on my list. Definitely a film you do not want to miss out on. Next up we have Spider-Man 2, released in 2004, and outright this is honestly my favourite comic book movie of all time. The film is set 2 years after the first installment, and it heavily evolves Peter Parker as a character, far beyond initial expectations, where he inexplicably loses his Spider-Man powers. And this draws Peter all the more closer to MJ. It allows him to build kind of a social life outside of just being Spider-Man. And this is something that has been heavily absent for a significant amount of time for Peter. And so setting up the events of the film, its story is very much based on difficult choices and sacrificing personal goals for the greater good. And in comparison to, I guess, more recent Marvel movies, the creativity behind this film in particular, it just cannot be matched. From the cinematography alone, with unique kind of transition shots, and especially the fight sequences. I mean, how many times can we sit through the same rinse and repeat formulas of just mindless punching and kicking? The fight scenes in this film take huge advantage of the environments playing a part into certain stances, using powers beyond just obviously punch, kick. And this film takes things way ahead of their time, with Raimi delivering on some of the best choreographed moments. My personal favourite being the train sequence, which is ever iconic to this film, which is both brutal and exhilarating for how both the hero and the villain are pitted against one another, with those around them literally just being pawns in their own fist fight. It's very much a difficult situation to be in, and the way this is portrayed for the camera is absolutely stunning. Speaking of the villain, we have Otto Octavius, played by Alfred Molina, an incredibly talented actor who brilliantly utilizes the tragedy of circumstance for a villainous origin of becoming Doc Ock. And this film is, in my opinion, the perfect example of showing how, when children watch a superhero movie, they become inspired by the hero. Whereas watching a movie like this as an adult, we suddenly empathize with the villain. We understand the goals of someone who is perhaps looking to do something right, but is going about it the complete wrong way. And with insanely complex characters, the plot for this film is fairly simplistic. Dr. Octavius wants to create a sustainable power source that will run infinitely at little to no expense. And when this, I guess, inevitably goes wrong, the artificial tentacle arms develop an intelligence that breaks away from Otto being the host, and instead controls him, making him into a villain. And this film has so many memorable moments, but the end scene in particular, with Doc Ock trying to recreate the experiment, holds up really well, especially in terms of the CGI for the scene, but the writing in particular, the heartfelt dialogue exchange reflecting on previous lines spoken between Otto and Peter with their final confrontation. It really does live up to the heavy foreshadowing, and fulfilling a much-needed redemption arc. Otto takes back control of the mechanical arms and drowns the experiment, sacrificing all his hard work, but stopping it from harming New York City. And although simplistic, the way this story is told, it's hands down one of the best sequels I have ever seen. And Sam Raimi really does put his heart and soul into this movie, and it clearly shows with how much of the source material he has utilized. and what it really means to him, and this is for sure my favourite Spider-Man movie. And concluding the Sam Raimi trilogy, we have, of course, Spider-Man 3 from 2007. This film is arguably a mixed bag for most people. I personally enjoyed it for what it was. For the most part, the ending is a bit of a convoluted mess, and it is well known that Raimi surprisingly hates this movie.
I messed up plenty with the third Spider-Man, so people, hated me.
Why? What do they say?
We hate you. I tried to make it work, but didn't really believe in all the characters, and so that can't be hidden from people who love Spider-Man.
The reason being, in short, studio interference. You can tell which characters Raimi wanted to expand on, where a certain character was forced into the film by the studio executives. And some words from Raimi that I heavily respect, kind of paraphrasing, that do come to mind is that if a director doesn't love a project, then they shouldn't be making it, and this speaks volume in retrospect. He did not love Venom as a character. He didn't seem to fully understand the character like he did compared to other villains, and although Venom does dominate this film as arguably the main villain, this was not always the case, and to be honest I feel wasn't the intention. Venom fits into the movie, but a lot of the content feels really forced and takes away from the emotional journey of forgiveness that Peter does eventually arrive at. The origin of the symbiote is unknown, with a cliche of it just came from outer space. Where beyond this, I do quite like how they portray the feelings of aggression and corruption within the host of the symbiote. The black suit Spidey is a very unique look, and I love the animation of the sort of jet black kind of liquid taking aggressive shape as it seeks out a suitable host, and I would highly recommend checking out the behind the scenes documentaries on this film in particular. There's loads of great bonus content across all the DVDs, but this one in particular really does provide quite an interesting insight behind adding this character of Venom, and on reflection does show a lot of the difficulties experienced with adding such a complicated character into a film like this. Coming off the iconic "Avenge Me" scene in the second film, we see conflict between Spidey and Harry Osborn spiral out of control, where Harry is engulfed by revenge, wanting to kill Peter, where he blames Spider-Man for the murder of his father, and as we know, Norman, he did this to himself.
Oh.
But this is where the emotional conflict for Peter is seen primarily, such as where the Venom symbiote only goes to further reflect this change in behaviour. And we all remember the pure cringe from the dance scene, which admittedly hasn't aged too well. I guess in later years, this did give birth to some wonderful Bully Maguire memes, which we can all commend it for now, I suppose.
I have the high ground! Please don't say that.
But Peter's change in attitude really puts a lot of his relationships on the lines, especially with MJ, where he's instead seen flirting around with Gwen Stacy, a character that is completely sidetracked in comparison to what she would become in the reboot films. And giving Peter an overabundance in confidence, the black suit only seems to fuel the unnecessary ego, such as when he goes out and spites Eddie Brock, who would later become Venom. This is one of my favourite scenes, where he points out the edited fake images of Spider-Man handed over to the Daily Bugle, just to get revenge, just to spite somebody for essentially crossing him. And this added conflict is very interesting, but only seems to delay the process of Peter reaching the end goal of forgiveness to those who have wronged him. And this takes me to my personal favourite villain of the movie. Sandman has the best story arc in my mind, which is something I failed to appreciate when I was a lot younger. Played by Thomas Haden Church, the actor, he emotes incredibly for a villain inspired by tragedy, again doing the wrong thing for the right reasons, such as in this instance, stealing to fund his dying daughter's medical bills. And you can really see the careful attention to detail that Raimi gives to this character, and in order to expand his storyline, he also incorporates the tragedy of Peter Parker's life from the first film, which is the shooting of Uncle Ben, where this scene is portrayed from a completely different perspective and somewhat retconned to an extent, where Sandman is partially responsible for the shooting. And this heavily builds on both characters, where we have one of my favourite sequences in this movie being the transformation for Sandman, where he wakes up a man torn apart both metaphorically and physically, and this scene is stunning for the CGI. It holds up really well, but most importantly, the music, the sorrowful melody as he rebuilds himself, is a glorious piece that establishes a sudden change in his thought process. No more being pushed around. He knows what he must do now for the benefit of his daughter, and that determination is something that's mirrored much later on in the film by Peter, once he's literally taken over by the Black Suit, where he wants revenge on Sandman, and seeing these characters conflict with one another is very intriguing. Wrapping the film, the end fight is quite messy, probably my least favourite bit of the entire movie, where there is a lot going on. Venom teams up with Sandman in order to take down Spidey just to kill him, and these scenes are very uncomfortable to watch at times. And Harry, he discovers for himself that Norman did kill himself, and so he jumps into the fight only to just sacrifice himself, which seems kind of redundant. Spidey does eventually take down Venom, he talks down Sandman, and saves MJ, who was captured and basically reverts back to being just a damsel in distress. Not really a big fan of that, did seem kind of unnecessary, but set a high enough stake for there being something on the line for Peter. It's a bittersweet ending. It does leave the trilogy on a fair note. Harry forgives Peter, and Peter forgives Sandman for the death of Uncle Ben. As a whole, the Raimi trilogy, it really has aged magnificently. I absolutely love all three of these movies. There's nothing overtly wrong with any of them in particular. I just feel that Spider-Man 3 is the weaker one out of the three. All three movies have a terrific blend of practical effects and CGI. They all look really refreshing compared to more contemporary films of today. And as a concluding chapter, Spider-Man 3 is okay. I would rank this at the number 6 spot. I think people overhate this movie. There are certainly worse films out there. And I think even Raimi, he wanted to redeem himself, and that's where we would have headed if the plans for Spider-Man 4 had stayed intact. I thought I'd feature a brief segment on Spider-Man 4 really just out of morbid fascination, as not much is known about Spider-Man 4. It was stated originally that the franchise, if it did well, could reach up to 6 movies, which would have been absolutely incredible. But obviously after the disagreements with the third film, Raimi felt as though one final film was more appropriate to redeem obviously what happened in the third installment, and he really wanted to big it up as Spidey's most difficult battle yet. And with only a handful of leaks, we have some kind of concept art for the movie, along with some confirmation of vague outline with some villain confirmations as well. Beyond that, there's really not much else. From the concept art, it did appear as though there would be quite the time jump, and Spider-Man seemed to be hauling in small-time villains, such as seen in the concept art, Mysterio was going to be one of them, and I loved those shots in particular, showing that Bruce Campbell, a close friend of Sam Raimi's, was actually going to cameo as that villain. And if you didn't already know, he's actually cameoed in each individual film of the Raimi trilogy. The main villain of this movie was set to be the Vulture, with it being rumoured that John Malkovich was headhunted for the role. And I would certainly love to see that. I think John Malkovich, with the somewhat zany, kind of unintentional comical personality he represents, especially coming off of films such as Being John Malkovich, which is one of my favourite movies of all time, I would love to see him take the role of a comic book villain. And certainly after what we have seen now with the Vulture in Spider-Man Homecoming, I definitely feel there was a lot of inspiration from the concept art of Spider-Man 4 that led obviously to the Michael Keaton incarnation of the character. I love the mechanical wings, and I also love how violent some of these fight sequences were set to become. But with the direction this film was going in, Sony bizarrely wanted to reboot the entire franchise. There were various production struggles which continued really for everyone involved, and eventually Sam Raimi was the bigger man and voluntarily left the project. And it seemed as though he did this really out of respect for the character, but also to Sony by not wasting their resources on something that he clearly wasn't happy with, and it's a shame that it had to happen this way, but I do admire Raimi for approaching it this way, rather than sort of half-heartedly making something that he just couldn't commit to. He needed to love this project, and obviously he wanted to, but the struggle was just too much, and he just couldn't follow through with what he had really intended. And so, this of course led to the Amazing Spider-Man movies as now a reboot from Sony for the Spider-Man franchise. And so this brings us to the first Amazing Spider-Man movie from 2012. And this film was directed by Mark Webb, and to be honest, I feel as though I've been very harsh on this film over the years. I still kind of struggle to sit through it. It's an okay movie, some parts are entertaining, and Andrew Garfield as Spider-Man, that's definitely an interesting one. He's a very comedic Spider-Man, but there are parts that honestly didn't really sit too well with me as the role of Peter Parker. He seemed to portray a mixture of being a dedicated student while also trying to seem like a rebellious student. He does have his moments though, and one of my favourites is the subway scene, which really made me laugh, where Peter accidentally knocks basically everyone out on the carriage when he's slowly discovering his Spider-Man powers. I've never heard someone apologise so much at once.
I'm sorry. Oh, sorry.
The origin side of things is very similar to what we have seen in the Tobey Maguire films, but it's made to be kind of less dramatic, and that makes it overall disinteresting in my honest opinion, where Peter sneaks into a lab room at Oscorp which is filled with spiders that literally pour down on his head, where one just stays on his person and bites him on the back of the neck. I do appreciate the discovery of his powers kind of varying from what we have seen before, but personally, I do prefer the Maguire origin story, where the cinematography is a lot more developed and certainly it captures your eye a lot better than what we see in this film. The one thing that I do really appreciate about this incarnation of Spider-Man is the building of the web shoot, as a lot of what Peter is as a student seems more science-based, which is definitely something I feel is a little bit absent in the Maguire films, but it's something that they've clearly utilised a lot more, and that's something that I do enjoy about this take on the character. Looking at some similarities and differences, we have Gwen Stacy played by Emma Stone, who was a huge breath of fresh air for the movie, where she was honestly one of my preferred parts of both Amazing Spider-Man films. She's an intriguing kind of love interest for Peter, making some scenes between the two characters feel very awkward, but I enjoyed how Gwen was essentially a way in for infiltrating Oscorp, which makes her a pivotal focus for the film. Really as a whole, she was that catalyst that allowed Peter to get into Oscorp, which then eventually led to the spider bite scene. And then looking at a similarity that I really appreciated, similar to the original Sam Raimi Spider-Man movie, we are put through another turmoil of an Uncle Ben death. But I genuinely really liked the simplicity of the scene that sets up the death of the character with the robber in the supermarket, and it does follow the same kind of steps as previous, but this scene really does heavily build on Peter's journey, where Andrew Garfield delivers a very evocative performance throughout this sequence. For the villain this time around, we have the Lizard, a character that I am not overly familiar with beyond this film, not really a character I particularly care for, but having said that, Dr. Connors was overall quite an intriguing villain for sure. The cinematography throughout the film gives us some unique parallels, where we see the tragedy of Dr. Connors quite literally longing to perfect the growth of his right arm, and using an experimental treatment based on lizard DNA, this allows for the arm to rejuvenate a little too well, where he literally becomes fully absorbed into a human-lizard hybrid.
Nowhere to hide, Peter.
Overall, I found this film to be just okay. There's a huge lack of entertainment throughout where I feel it works fine for a reboot by ticking all the appropriate boxes, but it just doesn't feel really adventurous by doing anything too different beyond just swapping and changing a few characters. There are moments to appreciate throughout. There are some very well choreographed fight sequences. I particularly like the establishment of a familiar kind of world, with elements such as Oscorp as an example paving the way for a certain Green Goblin in the sequel, and the film in itself did succeed in making a villain that we haven't seen on screen before, that being the Lizard, seem threatening, with its eventual pursuit of biological weapons being a plot point that really did keep me hooked towards the end. And looking back on the film, as I mentioned, there are bits to enjoy, and overall, I think as I've watched this more and more over the years, I've appreciated certain things a lot more. But it's a film that leaves a lot to be desired, similarly with the sequel, which is why I'll be leaving this film at my number 7 spot. And this takes us to The Amazing Spider-Man 2, Mark Webb's second outing directing for the Spider-Man franchise. And I feel the vast majority see this as the weakest Spider-Man film overall. It suffers from repeated mistakes of Raimi's Spider-Man 3 by just cramming too much into one movie and not allowing things to kind of flesh out organically. And from the trailers, I remember genuinely being excited for this film. It looked like a huge step up from previous, with so many interesting new villains, which only culminated into disappointments. And with the established characters more or less remaining the same, let's focus on those villains. Electro, a very creepy character. I never thought I'd see Jamie Foxx act in such a way. And I can appreciate where the direction for that character was going, where he is very lonely. Life hasn't been the kindest to him, which is a feasible backstory, which cuts to him just wanting revenge as a guy that wanted attention. And he feels as though that attention just hasn't been given to him, which only further irritates him, where he lashes out against those who have disrespected him, only for Spider-Man to once again take the fame. And ironically, with the character that he was initially before becoming Electro, he adored Spider-Man to an almost childlike extent. With him now lashing out at his hero, I think that was an interesting dynamic, but beyond that, a lot of what that character was insanely creepy in my honest opinion. The side story between Peter Parker and Harry Osborn feels shoehorned, but I surprisingly found this to be one of the best parts of the film. And the actors actually have quite a lot of chemistry together, which is especially shown by Dane DeHaan, an actor that I find very underappreciated, who has had some bad luck over the years, to say the least. Personally, if you're looking for a film recommendation with him in, I would recommend checking out the Josh Trank movie Chronicle, if you want to see one of his best performances and a great deconstruction of what it means to be a villain. Definitely a very intriguing film at that. But with this rekindled friendship in this movie between Peter and Harry, it's quite heartwarming, and it gives very sort of human qualities to them both, revealing an ulterior motive from Harry that he is dying of a rare genetic condition that his father has suffered with, and he feels as though having a sample of Spider-Man's blood, of Peter's blood, may actually cure this illness, which is not overly explored too well in the film, but the end result becomes this creepy hissing goblin where Dane DeHaan as Harry Osborn takes the serum and then becomes the Green Goblin. And it does absolutely nothing for me. It's an embarrassment. Peter and Gwen have an ongoing chemistry throughout where they are surprisingly brought closer together despite the events of the previous film, where Peter promises to Gwen's father, Captain Stacy, played by Dennis Leary, that he will leave Gwen alone. And I think it's kind of interesting to see this alternative love interest, but her end is a premature snap, no pun intended, which this scene is very awkward and made the rest of the film feel very disinteresting, where I just didn't really care for any of the characters beyond that point. Which takes us to the last of the villains, the Rhino, an extremely underused character purposefully used in the marketing and trailers. And I actually quite liked the over-exaggerated CGI mech suit used for the final shot of the movie. This is clearly where things were, I guess, kind of setting up a third film in the franchise, but as we know, that didn't pay off. With this film, I was just left so underwhelmed. It could have been much better, but with no payoff, it's just so disappointing, which is why I placed this at the number 8 spot in my list. Similarly to Spider-Man 4, there were plans to culminate the previous 2 films into a third installment, and that was looking to either be released in 2016 or 2018, and it was very heavily hinted that this would be either a Sinister Six style movie, or it would have just been its own third film from outside of what the Sinister Six could have been if that was done as a spin-off. And most of the info about this third installment is just speculation based on comments from those involved from within the franchise. If it were Sinister Six, the Six would have consisted likely of Green Goblin, Doc Ock, Rhino, Vulture, Kraven the Hunter, leaving only one last spot vacant. But as we know, things didn't quite go to plan. Andrew Garfield was supposedly fired by Sony for not turning up to a press event, and this more or less killed these movies, and there were some ludicrous plans in the pipeline, such as bringing back Captain Stacy from the dead, along with Gwen as well, and then creating a Spider-Gwen spin-off movie. But since the MCU was taking off around this time, Sony were clearly planning to fully franchise Spider-Man for a new generation. I do genuinely commend Andrew Garfield as an actor for openly supporting what we have now, with Tom Holland taking over the character, and he's very clearly still intrigued by the future of Spider-Man, and I hope that means we may one day see Garfield return to the role. And as we delve into the more modernised Spider-Man movies, we have the first of the Tom Holland standalone movies, this being Spider-Man Homecoming, released in 2017, directed by John Watts. And this film, overall, I very much enjoyed. It was the first film of Spider-Man that was, I guess, a shared kind of project between Sony Pictures, who struck a deal with Marvel Studios, in order to allow the character to be utilised in projects outside of anything relating to Sony. And with Holland being introduced in the Captain America Civil War film, and then now going on to have his own solo movies while still cameoing here and there.
Captain? Big fan.
And what I like about this film is it utilizes the brief appearance in the third Captain America movie and essentially skips the anticipated origin where we don't see a spider bite, there's no Uncle Ben sequence, we just have Aunt May, and this film just jumps into Spider-Man being a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. The suit is provided by Tony Stark, which is the main kind of thread that hangs over this film, connecting it to the rest of the sort of Avengers franchise as it would be nowadays. And overall, I was pleasantly surprised by the presence that he had throughout the film anyway. Tony Stark is an interesting character, and I felt it was appropriate for Peter, who is still learning to have that kind of mentor figure with Tony wanting him to become a hero. Since the actors were so young in this movie, it made the school life aspect a lot more believable, rather than seeing people in their late 20s and 30s pretend to be in high school. And this is my favourite version of Peter Parker as a standalone, where we have the innocence of school life, which is a lot more, I guess, recognisable. Rather than Harry Osborn, we have Ned as a side character, Peter's best friend. And he adds a lot of unexpected humour that is genuinely funny. I find a lot of the humour in the MCU feels very forced and Disneyfied, but the wit in this film and the writing is something that does keep things feeling fresh, in particular the dialogue, mostly from Zendaya, who plays Michelle Jones, aka MJ. And with my favourite parts of these films, we have a focus now on the villain aspect. Michael Keaton as the Vulture, he fits fantastically into this MCU story. And working as a leader of a team of salvagers, Adrian Toomes disobeys government body that takes control of cleaning up any debris caused by world-threatening events. And with some standardized kind of exposition, we see Toomes cleaning up the wreckage caused by the New York fight in the first Avengers movie, which is a sort of brief kind of opening to this film, already giving us an origin for the villain, which is a lot more refreshing than starting with the origin of the hero, which is what I'm thankful for when it comes to the direction of this film. And becoming the Vulture years later, scavenging alien tech and building illegal weapons as a weapons dealer alongside minor villains such as the Shocker and Mason, aka the Tinkerer. Toombs is a very complex character. There are a lot of angles to him that Michael Keaton very cleverly portrays. One of the best moments is the twist reveal that Toombs is the father of Peter's love interest in the film, being Liz, who is a fairly generic character, but this sudden conflict, the dad talk scene in the car when they are going to the homecoming prom, is honestly delivered as one of the most intense scenes from the entire movie. And I really enjoyed a lot about what Tom Holland brought to the character of Spider-Man. This film was very refreshing by taking things in a completely different direction. Of course, it has to be franchised with how all of these films are connected now, which is, it's not something I'm a big fan of, but it's something I'm personally willing to overlook and accept in favour of a film that has clearly had a lot of effort put behind it, and that's why I'm going to put this at my number 5 spot. Jumping into something different, we have Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse, released in 2018. And this was definitely not what I expected. This was a complete blind buy for me a couple of years ago, and I recently rewatched a couple of clips from the movie, and I honestly forgot how much I enjoyed this film. The animation in particular is absolutely stunning, a very enjoyable soundtrack by Post Malone, and overall the story really exceeded my expectations, and the art style and how the characters are so well choreographed throughout only added to the visual aesthetic and the overall enjoyment gained from this movie. And thankfully, it isn't just a traditional kind of CGI animated film. The way it blends the different sort of varying styles and what it incorporates, such as with very sort of hand-drawn kind of figments, which allow it to disassociate from what you would kind of expect from just a generic animated feature film. And the film has a lot of kind of unique sort of quirks to it, particularly the sort of glitchy style, which is relevant to the plot of the Spider-Verse aspect of this story.
And obviously you've been glitching.
Glitching? No. Why would you even say that?
To my knowledge, this is the movie debut of the Miles Morales incarnation of Spider-Man, and his origin story is kind of typical for what you expect, but it's delivered in such a way that uses backhanded comedy without the need to really explain the events leading up to the bite moment. And in general, the film is very self-aware. It tries not to linger on something for too long, where the pacing throughout is very quick, and apart from really the occasional dialogue exchange, it kind of relies upon you being familiar with the essential parts of Spider-Man / Peter Parker, and utilizes those key themes with Miles Morales taking the reins as the main kind of spider person for this story. And throughout this film, there are a lot of villains scattered throughout. Some are heavily story-based, such as Kingpin, who is the main antagonist. The Prowler was incorporated into the story very well with a fantastic twist relating to Miles, which I personally did not expect. And other villains kind of just take a back seat, such as Green Goblin, basically just used as a henchman. But one of my favourite moments was Olivia Octavius being Doc Ock. Again, another great twist that I personally did not expect, which really does show how concise the writing is for this movie. And with the writing, despite how concise it is for the characters, the plot in itself is fairly convoluted, but it suits the style of an animated movie. I don't think anything like this could really be achieved in live action. And so using a super collider, Kingpin wants to unlock gateways to alternative dimensions in order to reunite with his family who sadly perished in the established universe. And so while doing this, different variants of Spider-Man are brought into the same universe in order to try and save it from being unintentionally ripped apart. And these characters are so heavily varied, some of which I was genuinely not familiar with at all. And once again, the film does save time by combining each individual origin story into a kind of character montage, which I quite liked. And the characters are all very similar in terms of their origin anyway. And so standouts for me, we have the noir, sort of detective-style Spider-Man, which I really enjoyed. We have the anime-style Penny Parker and her robot, along with Spider-Ham, a character that was, I guess, going to be a popular fit anyway, and something that was clearly going to be utilized for selling toys, merchandise, etc. But the film in itself, overall, a very welcome surprise. I'm very excited to see where the sequel will take us. I'd imagine it'll once again relate to ripping open alternative dimensions, but I'd like to think a sequel to something this substantial would be far more interesting, ideally exceeding the first film. And with how impressed I was by this movie, I'm going to rank this at my number 4 spot. With this being the most recent theatrical Spider-Man movie, we have Far From Home from 2019. And this is my personal favourite of the two MCU Spidey movies. The first one did a great job at expanding on Peter Parker, showing him in action as Spider-Man, and once again made things seem new and exciting. But in this film in particular, we see Peter Parker taken out of his comfort zone as his class takes a trip over to Venice, Italy, and this is where we are introduced to Mysterio, played phenomenally by Jake Gyllenhaal. And I am sure those going into the film were somewhat familiar with Mysterio, knowing that he is in fact a villain and not a hero as the trailers made him out to be. And Gyllenhaal makes the character extremely charismatic and believable, standing as his alter ego Quentin Beck. And he claims to be from another dimension, fighting elemental monsters that have broken into the current reality, and with how convoluted all of this sounds, Nick Fury and the agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. just conveniently believe him. And with modernizing this character, it's revealed that Mysterio has been using projector drones to create visuals that will fool the world into thinking that he is a hero. And Gyllenhaal's acting is just so groundbreaking that we do believe him at first, until of course, the reveal scene. With this film being set after Avengers Endgame, after the demise of Tony Stark, Peter Parker is looking for a new role model, and he sees this in Quentin, who he truly believes to be a positive influence. And so handing over an experimental AI known as Edith, without really knowing what capabilities it could have when used in the wrong hands. Initially this was a gift from Tony Stark to Peter, but he feels as though it belongs in the hands of someone who can do right with it. And the reveal scene, although I guess somewhat obvious, is one of my personal favourites. It shows how Quentin really felt betrayed by Stark Industries, where he now seeks revenge, along with those who are part of his crew and those who are basically pushed aside. He wants to get justice for what happened to him in particular. MJ discovers that Peter is in fact Spidey, which only goes to further complicate things for the two characters, but I did really enjoy seeing them both work together, where the main plot now is trying to defeat Beck, now knowing what he can do, which almost becomes frustrating, which I guess is kind of the point, where the lines are blurred between what is real and what is instead an illusion. And the dreamlike sequence of hallucinatory visuals is easily one of my favourite scenes from the MCU. And with the plot kind of being basic enough, the acting and unique visuals really sold me on this film to a much grander scale, and that's why I'm going to place this at my number 3 spot in my top 8 list. As for the future of Spider-Man, No Way Home is something I've been looking forward to for a little while. I've enjoyed seeing all the rumours and speculation about the film, and I was instantly sold on the concept of a Spider-Verse in the MCU when I saw in the recent trailer Alfred Molina being incorporated into there, and I did follow the reports of him reprising the role as Doc Ock. I think he unintentionally sort of accidentally revealed himself to be in the film. And I have no idea how this is going to work out. Marvel Studios are being secretive with this film for a reason, and I really do hope we see Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield reprise their roles as Spider-Man. Do I think it will happen? Probably not. it does seem a little bit too far-fetched for something like that to happen. It seems, I guess, too fan-servicey, which I don't know whether or not Marvel Studios would want to conform to that and make the fans happy, or tease them a little bit longer. But on the other hand, with Sam Raimi involved now with directing the Doctor Strange sequel, I'd like to think he has perhaps had some form of involvement with No Way Home as a movie. If it is true that actors such as Willem Dafoe are returning and reprising as their original roles, such as obviously the Green Goblin, I am sure Raimi has at the very least been consulted on using his versions of these villainous characters. And plus we have Doctor Strange featuring heavily in this movie anyway, undoing the events of the post-credit scene from the second film where Mysterio reveals Spider-Man's identity to the world, delivering that last gut punch. And I'd like to think that Raimi has worked some magic in the background for what we are yet to see in terms of reveals in the MCU, and besides, I don't think the MCU is done with Spider-Man just yet anyway, unless we have another bizarre kind of contract issue that occurs later down the line. But regardless, I've enjoyed how we've seen villains that have never been portrayed on the big screen before, such as one that I do hope we get a follow-up to is what was hinted in the first film in the post-credit scene with Michael Mando as the Scorpion. He is a very talented actor coming off TV shows such as Better Call Saul, and I would love to see him, likewise with Mysterio coming back. I personally don't feel Mysterio did die on the bridge, and there's clearly a lot going on, and I guess only time will tell on the events yet to come. That's going to do it anyway for this extended kind of retrospective looking at the Spider-Man movies. I hope you did enjoy. If you did, be sure to leave me a like down below. Drop me a comment. What is your favourite Spider-Man movie? And for more videos, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, DVD Review Studios.
Are you threatening me?